They laughed in my face before I even finished the first sentence. That was how it began. Not with a debate, not with a disagreement, but with ridicule so sharp it cut through the air like glass. I had only risen to speak, to add a few words, words I thought mattered, words I believed deserved a place in the room. But the moment my voice broke the surface, the sound of laughter drowned it out. It was not the light laughter of surprise, it was cruel, mocking, dismissive. A wave of derision that rolled over me until I felt myself shrinking, my voice swallowed whole before it had a chance to live. I stood there, gripping the edge of the table, my throat tight, my chest heavy. My words faltered, not because I had lost them, but because I had been buried alive beneath the noise. They weren't laughing with me. They were laughing at me, as though my presence was the evening's entertainment, as though my attempt to speak was a performance meant for their amusement. Their eyes glistened with cruelty, smirks curling at the edges of their mouths. And for a moment, I wondered if they had planned it, if this humiliation had been waiting for me the moment I dared to open my mouth. The sound cut deeper because it came from familiar faces. Colleagues I had once trusted, friends who had once leaned on me, even family seated at the table. They all joined in, their voices blending together until it became impossible to tell one from another. Betrayal does not always come with sharp words. Sometimes it comes with laughter that strips the skin from dignity, leaving you raw and exposed. I felt it then, the sting of every chuckle, every whispered insult hidden behind hands that pretended to cover smiles. I tried again, but the laughter only grew. My voice broke under it, trembling, desperate for a space to exist, but no one offered it. No one silenced the others to let me speak. They let the wave roll on, let it drown me, because to them, I was not a man with something to say. I was a joke, a shadow, an intrusion on their stage. My chest tightened, my heart thudded harder with each mocking glance, and I realized that my words were no longer mine to give. They had stolen them before they left my mouth. And yet, beneath the humiliation, there was something else. A flicker, a pulse, a stubborn beat inside me that whispered, "This is not the end. The laughter may bury you for now, but truth has its way of clawing back to the surface." I swallowed hard, lowered my eyes, and sat down again. I gave them my silence, but it was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, waiting for its moment to break. Because I knew, even as they laughed, even as my son looked away in shame, even as the room forgot the man I was, that laughter cannot erase truth. And one day, they would have no choice but to hear my voice again. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This way you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to light. And now, we continue. The laughter did not end when their mouths closed. It lingered, echoing in my ears long after the last chuckle faded into the clinking of glasses and the shuffle of chairs. It became a sound larger than the room, a weight pressing into me from every side, filling the silence that should have followed. It grew until it was not just laughter. It was a verdict that declared me an outsider, an intruder, a man whose voice had no place among theirs. I sat back down slowly, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself, but no one noticed. No one cared to see the storm they had unleashed inside me. They were already leaning into each other again, voices rising, laughter continuing at other jokes, the rhythm of the evening restored. For them, my humiliation was a momentary spectacle, quickly consumed and forgotten. But for me, it was a sentence written in fire. The weight of that humiliation grew heavier with every passing second. I felt it pressing against my chest, as though the very air had turned thick and unbreathable. My throat still burned with the words I had not spoken, words that now felt poisoned, stripped of their strength. My attempt to rise and be heard had left me smaller than before, a shadow folding in on itself. Around me the room carried on as if I were invisible. Plates clattered, glasses chimed, conversations burst and collided, but none of it touched me. I was exiled, sitting at the same table but in another world entirely. There is a loneliness in humiliation that cannot be compared to solitude. To be alone is to be unseen. To be humiliated is to be seen too clearly and then dismissed as nothing. That was what I felt, stripped bare in front of those I knew, reduced not to a man with history and voice, but to a figure of mockery. I could almost hear the unspoken words beneath their laughter. You don't matter. You never did. I looked around the table, searching for one face, any face that might hold a flicker of kindness, but there was none. My wife avoided my eyes, pretending to sip her drink. My son looked away, shame coloring his cheeks, but not for me, for himself. Embarrassed to be linked to the man they had ridiculed. My colleagues leaned into their conversations, their laughter too easy, too free. Betrayal, I realized, does not always come in anger. Sometimes it comes in silence, in the choice not to stand for you when you are torn down. And their silence weighed heavier than the laughter itself. The humiliation clung to me like a second skin, burning hot against my chest. I could not peel it away, could not shake it off. Every chuckle replayed in my mind, louder than the last, until it became a chorus that drowned out even my own heartbeat. I wanted to speak again, to force my voice into the air, to demand a space for my truth, but I knew the outcome. They would only laugh louder. They had already judged me unworthy of being heard. So I sat there, still and quiet, swallowed by the noise of their world. But beneath the weight pressing me down, another weight stirred, the weight of memory, of experience, of truth. It did not rise yet, did not fight, but it waited, steady and patient. They thought my silence was defeat. They did not know it was survival. They did not know that the words they tried to bury inside me would one day break free, not with force, but with a power that no laughter could stop. For now I carried the humiliation like a stone strapped to my chest, every breath harder than the last. But deep inside I knew, stones can also be foundations, and this moment, though it burned, would one day become the ground on which I stood again. Betrayal always cuts deepest when it comes from those you once called your own. The laughter of strangers wounds, yes, but it fades with distance. The laughter of family, of colleagues who once stood beside you, of people whose trust you carried like a shield, that laughter does not fade. It lingers in the marrow, poisoning everything it touches. I sat there, my eyes moving across the table, searching for even a trace of kindness, of defense, of memory. What I found instead was indifference wrapped in easy smiles. My wife lowered her gaze, stirring the drink in her glass, as if the circles of liquid could distract her from the weight of the moment. She would not meet my eyes, not because she hadn't heard the laughter, but because she had, and she chose silence. That silence, more than the mocking voices, crushed me. It said, "I will not stand for you." My son, my own flesh and blood, leaned back in his chair, pretending not to notice. He fiddled with his phone, cleared his throat, shifted as though uncomfortable, but never once lifted his head to defend me. I had raised him to believe in dignity, to know the worth of a man's word. And yet when the moment came, when his father's dignity was torn apart in front of him, he let it happen. Worse still, there was shame on his face, but it was not for me. He was ashamed of being connected to me, ashamed to claim me in front of the others. That shame pierced deeper than laughter ever could. And then there were the colleagues, men and women who had once leaned on me in times of crisis, who had sat with me long into the night to solve problems that threatened to break us all. I had carried them when they faltered, offered my voice when theirs failed. I had been their shield, their guide, their silent anchor. And now I watched them laugh the loudest, their mouths wide with cruelty, their eyes sparkling with the joy of seeing me diminished. They had not just forgotten, they had chosen betrayal. They laughed because it was easier than remembering, easier than admitting how much they owed to the man they now treated as a joke. The sound of their betrayal echoed louder than any mockery. Because betrayal is not just laughter, it is the rewriting of history in front of your eyes. It is watching those who once trusted you decide, suddenly, that you never mattered. It is the stripping away of your place, leaving you hollow in a room where you once stood strong. My chest tightened as I watched them, one by one, pretending nothing had happened. Their conversations picked up again, light and careless, as though my humiliation had been no more than background noise. They had turned me into a spectacle and then erased me, leaving me present but unseen, seated among them yet exiled. Betrayal is not just in cruelty. It is in pretending afterward that cruelty never happened. I looked down at my hands. These were the hands that had worked for them, that had built for them, that had sacrificed in silence so that they could sit here now in their arrogance. These hands had once carried weight they could not bear, had once been trusted without hesitation. And now? Now they were treated as useless, as clumsy, as irrelevant. My own family, my own colleagues, had joined the chorus of laughter against me. That betrayal settled heavier than stone in my chest. It was not rage that filled me. It was grief. Grief for the trust that had been broken. Grief for the bond that had been severed. The laughter of strangers might have stung for a night, but the laughter of my own people would echo in me forever. I sat there quietly, swallowing that grief, carrying it alone. They believed they had silenced me, buried me in ridicule. But betrayal, no matter how sharp, does not erase truth. It only delays it. And even as I sat there, humiliated, I felt it deep inside me, the truth waiting, patient, unshaken, stronger than their laughter, stronger than their betrayal. The laughter still rang in my ears, but behind it, stronger than the sound of mockery, rose the memories I could never erase. They came back uninvited, breaking through the humiliation, flooding me with images of the years I had given away. I remembered the long nights when the city slept and I remained awake, bent over papers, over plans, over the fragile weight of promises made to people who depended on me. I remembered the cold dawns when I walked home, too tired to lift my head, yet satisfied because I knew something I had done would make another's life easier, safer, better. I remembered the meetings where I stayed long after the others had gone, reading every line, measuring every choice, because I could not betray the trust of those who had placed their future in my hands. I remembered shaking hands with men and women who had nothing but faith, who looked at me with eyes filled not with laughter but with hope. They believed me when I said, "I will help you." They believed me when I said, "Your voice matters." And I had carried those promises like weights I could never put down. Sacrifice is not always grand. It is not always written in headlines or praised in speeches. More often it is quiet. It is in the sleepless nights, the long hours, the moments when your family wonders why you are absent. It is in the lines that carve themselves into your face, in the exhaustion you carry in your bones. I had sacrificed like that for years, never asking for applause, never expecting reward. I believed the work itself was enough, that the good it left behind would be the only recognition I needed. But as I sat there, surrounded by their laughter, it felt as if all of it had been erased. One wave of ridicule had swept across the table and washed away decades of effort. My promises, my work, my sacrifices, none of it seemed to matter to them anymore. I was not the man who had given his strength to others. I was not the man who had poured his life into service. In their eyes, I was only a joke. It struck me then how fragile memory is. All the nights I had given, all the years I had carried, gone in an instant, buried under the cruelty of those who chose to forget. They would rather laugh at me than remember what I had done. And yet, inside me, those sacrifices lived on. They were carved into me, carved so deep that no laughter could erase them, no betrayal could burn them away. I thought of the faces I had met along the way. The old man who once gripped my hand with tears in his eyes, thanking me for listening when no one else would. The young mother who whispered, "You've given me hope again." The countless voices that had once found comfort in mine. They had trusted me when I had nothing but my word to give. They had believed in me when I had only my hands and my will to fight for them. And now those same hands rested heavy on the table, veins visible, skin worn, trembling with age. To those around me they were useless, relics of another time. But I knew better. These were the hands that had built something that could not be undone. The laughter tried to bury me, but as I closed my eyes for a moment, I realized something. The weight I carried was not humiliation. It was memory. And memory is stronger than ridicule, because ridicule fades, but sacrifice endures. Their laughter would die in seconds. My years would live forever, etched not in their mouths, but in the lives of those who had once whispered thank you. I opened my eyes again, still silent, still small in their view, but inside me I was larger than their laughter, because I carried sacrifices they could never understand, promises they had chosen to forget, but which time itself would remember. They thought they had erased me. They did not know they had only sharpened the truth, waiting to return. I did not stand again. The temptation burned inside me. My chest ached with the words I had wanted to finish, the truth I had wanted to lay before them. But I forced myself to remain still. My lips stayed closed, my hands folded tightly in my lap, my gaze fixed somewhere past the table, as though the noise could not touch me. Around me the room swelled with voices, their laughter returning, their arrogance filling every corner, but inside me there was only stillness. At first they mistook that stillness for surrender. They believed they had silenced me completely, that their jeers and smirks had pushed me back into a place where my words no longer mattered. In their eyes I had been defeated, but what they could not see was that my silence was heavier than their laughter. Every moment I chose not to answer. The weight of what I carried grew, pressing down on them without their knowing. Because silence, when it is born of dignity, does not vanish. It gathers. I had learned this long ago, in other rooms, under other lights, when men had argued and shouted while I sat waiting for the truth to surface. I had learned that truth is not fragile. It does not break when mocked. It does not crumble when ignored. It waits, patiently, relentlessly. It waits until arrogance exhausts itself, until lies collapse under their own emptiness, until the moment comes when the truth alone can stand. That was the silence I held inside me now, not weakness, not fear, but patience, sharpened into steel. Their laughter faded into ordinary chatter, but it did not leave me. It remained, echoing in my chest, a scar etched by voices that should have known better. And yet, even as humiliation burned in me, there was a deeper current moving beneath it, steady and unshaken. They had not buried me. They had only revealed themselves. Their cruelty was theirs to carry, and one day it would weigh on them heavier than it had ever weighed on me. I lowered my eyes to the table so they would not see the flicker in them, the quiet fire that their laughter had only stoked. My silence looked small to them, almost pitiful. But I knew better. This silence was not an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of their reckoning. The beginning of justice that arrives without shouts or arguments. The kind that comes slowly, steadily, until it is undeniable. So I let them laugh. I let them forget me. I let them believe that their voices had triumphed over mine, because one day the truth they tried to crush beneath their jeers would rise, not as a whisper, not as a plea, but as a force too heavy to ignore. And when that moment came, my silence would no longer be their victory. it would be the shadow of their defeat. The room swelled with noise, as if their laughter at me had only been a warm-up for the real performance, the performance of their own importance. Voices collided, sharp and loud, one speaking over another, no one listening, everyone fighting to be heard. They raised glasses as though victory was already theirs, their hands cutting through the air with sweeping gestures meant to dominate, to occupy space, to prove that their voices alone mattered. It was not a conversation. It was a battle of egos, a storm of vanity disguised as dialogue. I watched them, one by one, leaning across the table, spilling their words as though the world could not survive without their opinions. They laughed too loudly at their own jokes, interrupted each other with smug grins, and shook their heads with practiced disdain whenever someone else dared to disagree. Power for them was not in truth, not in service, not in sacrifice. It was in volume, in spectacle, in the ability to drown others out. My silence, to them, was evidence of irrelevance. They mistook restraint for emptiness. They believed that only the loud have weight. Every clink of a glass seemed to declare their triumph. Every burst of laughter was a declaration that they owned the room, that no one outside their circle deserved to be heard. My words, what little I had tried to offer, were not just dismissed, they were erased, treated as an intrusion on the stage they had built for themselves. I sat among them, but I was not one of them. In their eyes, I was furniture, present but voiceless, a reminder of something old and unnecessary. And yet, as I watched, I saw clearly what they could not. Their arrogance filled the room, yes, but it also hollowed it. Their noise was not strength, it was desperation. The way they trampled over each other's words revealed it. None of them truly listened. None of them truly believed in what they said. They sought only to be the last voice left standing, not to speak truth, but to win the noise. It was a chaos that devoured itself, and though they did not realize it, that chaos would one day collapse under its own weight. I sat back, my eyes half lowered, my breath steady. They thought I had nothing left to give, that my silence was weakness. But I knew better. I had seen arrogance before, on battlefields of words and in darker places where lives, not arguments, were at stake. I had seen men who thought themselves invincible, who believed their power unshakable, crumble when truth rose before them. The louder arrogance shouts, the more fragile it becomes. Their laughter rolled on, their arguments spiraled higher, their voices turned the air thick with conceit. But I did not join them. I did not rise. I did not try to cut through the noise. My silence sat heavier than their arrogance, heavier than their voices. They thought I had been pushed aside, but the truth was simpler. They had revealed themselves. And when the time came, when a single voice stronger than theirs entered that room, all their laughter would collapse into silence. For now, I remained still, surrounded by their arrogance, swallowed in their noise. But inside me, there was a calm they could never touch, because I knew noise fades, arrogance burns itself out, and when it does, only truth remains. The room thundered with voices, laughter swelling like waves against stone, but none of it truly reached me. Beneath the noise, beneath the clinking of glasses and the scrape of chairs, I heard something else, something steady, something deeper, my own heartbeat, slow, heavy, relentless. It pulsed in my chest like a drum, louder than their arrogance, stronger than their scorn. It reminded me of who I was long before this evening, long before their laughter tried to bury me. Each beat carried memories, Nights when my heart had kept me awake, refusing to let me rest, because work remained unfinished, because promises had yet to be fulfilled. Days when it raced with urgency as lives hung in the balance, when hesitation could mean failure. I had lived by its rhythm, trusted it when the world spun into chaos. And now, here in this room filled with mockery and pride, it spoke to me again, not in words, but in certainty. Wait, endure, the truth always returns. I sat in silence while they argued and laughed, while their voices tangled in a storm of vanity. My eyes drifted across their faces, each one certain of their own importance, blind to the emptiness of their noise. They thought I had been silenced, thought my voice had been stripped away, but I could feel it, deep within. The truth did not vanish simply because they refused to hear it. It lived in me, quiet and patient, waiting for the moment when arrogance would exhaust itself and silence would demand something greater to fill it. My heartbeat was steady, unshaken by humiliation. They had laughed at me, yes. They had reduced me to a shadow in their eyes. But shadows endure where flames burn out. Their pride would consume itself. Their noise would fade. But my silence, anchored in patience, would outlast them all. For silence tied to truth is never empty. It is a force hidden beneath still waters, gathering strength for the moment it is called to rise. I took in a slow breath, letting it steady me. I no longer fought the humiliation. I let it sit where it wanted, heavy and cold, because I knew it would not remain forever. Humiliation is fleeting. Dignity, once rooted in sacrifice, waits. It bends, but does not break. My heart, still beating, reminded me of this with every thud. They saw me as defeated, as finished. But what they did not understand is that endurance is its own kind of power. Not the power of noise, not the power of force, but the quiet strength of patience. And patience, though invisible, always wins, because truth cannot be erased, it can only be delayed. So I sat, hearing only the sound of my own heart, steady as a drum. It told me not to rush, not to fight their noise with my voice. It told me that the time would come when I would be heard, not because I demanded it, but because the truth would demand it for me. And as I sat surrounded by their arrogance, their laughter ringing hollow, I realized something. They thought they had silenced me, but in truth, I was the only one still listening, to the one thing that mattered, to the beat of patience, to the reminder that silence, when it carries truth, is louder than any storm of voices. The storm of voices was at its loudest when the sound of the door opening cut through it like a blade. At first, no one noticed. The laughter was too thick, the arguments too tangled. But then the figure stepped inside, and the very air shifted. The senator had arrived. He did not need to speak. His presence alone was enough, a man whose word could shape laws, whose nod could make careers rise or fall. His reputation walked before him like a shadow larger than the room itself. The laughter, so loud only a moment ago, faltered into silence. Glasses lowered halfway to lips. Conversations died mid-sentence. One by one, chairs straightened, spines stiffened. Faces rearranged themselves into masks of respect. The same voices that moments earlier had mocked me now pressed themselves into silence, desperate to be seen as dignified in his eyes. But I remained where I was, in the corner, half-shadowed, hands folded, body still. They had forgotten me again in their rush to welcome him, their hunger for his attention washing away every trace of cruelty they had shown only minutes before. I watched them rise from their seats to greet him, each scrambling to be the first to shake his hand, to offer him a chair, to prove their importance in his presence. Their arrogance transformed into obedience, their noise into reverent quiet, as if they had never laughed at all. The senator's eyes moved calmly across the room, acknowledging handshakes, returning greetings with the faintest nods. He carried himself with the kind of composure that does not demand respect, but commands it. The room bent toward him without resistance, as though he were the axis around which it spun. And still I sat in silence. I did not move. I had no desire to rise, no ambition to place myself in his path as the others did. I had been invisible long before he entered, and I remained invisible now. For me, his arrival was not an opportunity to be seen. It was a mirror of everything I had endured. These people, who moments before had mocked me, now tripped over themselves for a man whose presence they craved. They gave him what they denied me: silence, respect, attention. Yet I watched him carefully. Unlike the others, his eyes did not linger on the loudest, nor on the ones crowding closest to him. He studied the room differently, searching, measuring. His gaze carried weight, not flattery. And though I sat still, hidden almost in the dim of the corner, something told me his eyes would find me too. The noise had ended. The room that had once burst with arrogance now waited breathlessly for the senator's words. Their laughter, their dismissal of me, had vanished like smoke in the presence of greater power. But I did not rise to join them. I stayed in the shadows, my silence holding steady, heavier than ever. Because I knew the truth. Power shifts like the wind. Today they bent to him. Yesterday they laughed at me. Tomorrow they would face what they could not avoid. For now, I waited, quiet and calm, while the senator stood in the doorway, his presence reshaping the room that had once buried me in humiliation. They thought I was nothing, but I knew. Moments like this are where silence begins to turn. The senator moved further into the room, his steps unhurried, his composure unshakable. One by one, people pressed forward to greet him, eager smiles plastered across their faces, voices lowered now, in tones of reverence. They shook his hand, as though touching him might elevate them, as though proximity to his power might grant them power of their own. Each one leaned in too eagerly, their laughter now forced, their arrogance recast as respect. He returned their greetings politely, but with little warmth, his eyes already moving on before their words had finished. He scanned the room, not as a man impressed, but as one who measured. His gaze carried a weight sharper than theirs combined, and it seemed to strip away the masks they had so hastily put on. Those who had been loudest now tried hardest to appear dignified, their faces flushed, their gestures stiff. And then it happened. His eyes swept past the table, past the men and women who bent themselves into flattery, past my son who stood straighter than before, desperate to be noticed. For a moment it seemed he would continue on, unmoved by the performance, but his gaze shifted and stopped on me. The air inside my chest thickened. For the first time that night, I felt the weight of being truly seen. His eyes did not hold mockery, did not flicker with disdain like the others. There was no smirk, no dismissal. His look was steady, searching, almost curious, as though he recognized something others had chosen to forget. I did not move. I did not lower my head, nor did I rise to meet his attention. I sat as I had sat all evening, still, silent, on the edge of the table where shadows touched the floor. But in that silence, under his gaze, I no longer felt invisible. The laughter of moments ago seemed to echo faintly, but in his eyes it lost its power. He was not looking at a man reduced to silence. He was not looking at a relic or a burden. His glance was not the glance of someone searching for entertainment or dismissal. It was the glance of someone who sees through the noise and finds what others are too blind to notice. Around me I could feel the unease ripple. Others noticed too. That pause, that moment when his attention fixed on me instead of them. My son shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his hand twitching at the table. My colleagues who had laughed the loudest now fell even quieter, their eyes flickering nervously between me and the senator, as though trying to understand what he saw that they had missed. For me, it was not triumph I felt, but a strange, heavy calm, the kind of calm that comes when justice begins to turn. Not with noise, not with vengeance, but with the quiet recognition of truth. The senator's gaze lingered just long enough to remind me that silence is never wasted. Patience always finds its witness. I did not smile, I did not gloat. I let the moment sit, heavy and unbroken, as his eyes held mine. Because in that glance I knew, the story they tried to bury with laughter was not gone. Someone had seen me. And that was the beginning. The room held its breath. For a moment the senator's gaze lingered on me, steady and unbroken, and then he spoke. My name fell from his lips, crisp and deliberate, as if he were laying it gently but firmly into the silence. Not a mistake, not an afterthought, but a recognition. The sound cut through the room more powerfully than any laughter had before. All the noise, all the arrogance, collapsed beneath that single word. My name, spoken aloud with respect, carried more weight than their jeers ever could. Heads turned instantly. My colleagues stiffened, the smiles they had pasted onto their faces faltering. My son blinked, caught between pride and shame, his shoulders trembling almost imperceptibly. Even my wife froze, her hand tightening around the glass she held. They had all grown used to my silence, to my invisibility, to the idea that I could be dismissed without consequence. But the senator had seen me. Worse for them, he had acknowledged me. Then came the words that broke the night open. Please, finish your thought. I would like to hear it. Spoken calmly, without demand, but with authority that silenced everything else. It was not a request born of politeness. It was an invitation, edged with power, an order hidden in courtesy, the kind of words that leave no space for interruption, no space for mockery. I felt the shift in the air around me. Those who had laughed only moments before now looked at me differently, their faces paling as if they had suddenly realized their mistake. Their laughter seemed foolish now, their arrogance exposed, because the one man in the room who commanded respect had chosen me, not them. For a heartbeat I remained still, my throat tightened with the weight of the moment, not from fear, but from the enormity of it, the humiliation I had carried, the betrayal that had burned inside me, all of it suddenly bent beneath the strength of those words. My name, spoken clearly, had lifted me from the shadows where they had tried to bury me. I let the silence stretch a moment longer. Not to punish, not to gloat, but because I wanted them to feel the weight of what had happened. The senator had not called on the loudest, nor the proudest. He had not rewarded those who had shouted the longest. He had looked past all of them, through the arrogance, through the noise, and had chosen the one they had tried to erase. Slowly I lifted my head. My eyes met his, steady and calm. I did not rush. I did not stumble. I let my dignity return to me, like a tide rolling in after a long storm. And when I finally drew breath to speak, I knew that every ear in the room, those that had mocked, those that had ignored, even those that had betrayed, now belonged to me. Because truth had been given its moment, and this time no one would dare laugh. The senator's words still hung in the air when the silence fell. It was not the silence of indifference, nor the silence of dismissal. It was something far heavier, the kind of silence that presses against the skin, that steals the breath from a room, that forces even the proudest to lower their eyes. A moment ago, this hall had been filled with noise, mocking laughter, clashing voices, the sharp arrogance of people who thought they owned every corner of attention. Now all of it was gone. My name had been spoken with respect, and in that single act, the balance had shifted. Those who had laughed the loudest could not look at me, their heads bent low, eyes suddenly fascinated by the patterns on the tablecloth, their fingers twitching against half-filled glasses. They had been so bold in their mockery, so certain of my irrelevance. But now that the senator himself had asked me to speak, they were stripped of that certainty. The same mouths that jeered were locked tight, unwilling to meet the truth that weighed in the silence. I sat motionless, but the room belonged to me in a way it never had before. It was not because I had demanded it, not because I had shouted over them, but because silence itself had changed hands. For so long, they had given me silence as punishment, pushing me into the corner, pretending I did not exist. But now, silence was theirs to endure, heavy, suffocating, merciless. Every heartbeat seemed louder against it, every breath a reminder of what they had done. My son sat rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes lowered. He had once told me my words meant nothing. He had once joined the chorus of dismissal, ashamed of the father who dared to raise his voice. But now he sat in shame of another kind, the shame of realizing he had laughed at a man chosen by the only voice in the room that mattered. His silence burned brighter than any apology he could have offered. And my colleagues, the men and women who had once leaned on me, trusted me, followed me, now looked like children caught in their own cruelty. They had mocked me for daring to speak, and now they were forced to face the senator's command that my voice be heard. Their arrogance melted into discomfort, their pride collapsed into unease. This was their silence now, not mine. And it was a silence no laughter could rescue them from. I lifted my eyes slowly, not rushing, letting the moment breathe. My gaze swept the room, touching one face after another. None of them could hold it. Every time my eyes found theirs, they flinched, looked away, pressed their lips together tightly. I did not need to speak yet. My silence was enough to remind them that dignity does not vanish when ignored. It only waits. And now, that dignity had returned with a force greater than any argument. The senator watched me with calm patience, his nod almost imperceptible, but it was there. He had given me the floor not out of politeness, but because he had recognized something the others had refused to see. In his presence, their laughter looked cheap. Their arrogance looked hollow. The silence that spread across the room was their undoing. I breathed in slowly, my chest steady, and for the first time that night, the weight of humiliation lifted. It had not been erased, but it had been transformed. The silence that once suffocated me now sat on their shoulders, heavier than stone, breaking them in ways they did not expect. I did not need to punish them. Silence was already doing it for me. And as I opened my mouth, ready to let my words finally breathe, I knew one thing with certainty. Laughter had been their weapon, but silence had become my justice. When I finally opened my mouth, the first sound that left me was almost fragile, as if my own voice had grown unused to air after being buried so long beneath mockery. It trembled at the edges, thin and quiet, like the echo of a man who had been silenced too often. For a heartbeat, I feared it would fail me again, swallowed by the memory of their laughter. But then I felt it, the steady pulse of my heart, the weight of the senator's gaze, and the gravity of the silence pressing down on the room. My voice did not break. It grew. Each word came slowly at first, like steps taken on unsteady ground. But with every phrase the footing grew firmer. My tone, once trembling, began to harden. I was not speaking for applause, not to impress, not to fight. I was speaking because truth had been given its place, and it would not be denied. My words were plain, stripped of embellishment, but they carried the kind of weight that can only be borne from years of sacrifice. I spoke of what I had seen, of the nights spent in service when no one else remained, of promises I had kept when others had abandoned them. I spoke of the lives touched, the choices that cost me comfort, the sacrifices that left scars too deep to see but impossible to erase. My words were not meant to dazzle, and that was why they struck. They were not rehearsed speeches or clever turns of phrase. They were fragments of truth, cut from the very flesh of my past. The faces around the table shifted as I went on. Some leaned back, their eyes heavy with shame. Others stared down at their hands, unable to meet me at all. My son's chest rose and fell quickly, his jaw tight, his lips pressed into a thin line, as though every word I spoke was a reminder of how he had dismissed me. And yet, he listened. He had no choice. None of them did. For the first time in years, my voice filled the room, not in volume, but in presence. It carried not because it was loud, but because it was true. Truth has a resonance arrogance cannot mimic. It strikes differently, bypassing pride and pressing directly into the conscience. That was the sound in my voice now. Not performance, not anger, not revenge, but something cleaner, sharper. The more I spoke, the steadier I became. The trembling was gone, replaced by calm strength. My silence had not been weakness. It had been waiting. And now, released, my words were stronger for it. Every sentence felt like a stone, placed back where it belonged, rebuilding the dignity they had tried to tear down. I did not look for approval. I did not seek their agreement. I spoke because the senator had asked me to, but more importantly, because I had carried these truths in silence for too long. And as they poured from me, I realized that I did not need to win them back. Their respect, their acknowledgement, it no longer mattered in the way it once had. The truth itself was enough. When I paused, the silence did not rush in to crush me as before. It remained, but it was different now. It was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of listening. The silence of recognition. The silence of people who could no longer deny what stood before them. And in that moment I knew my voice had returned, not in volume, not in spectacle, but in strength. And this time no laughter could take it away. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. Did not throw their laughter back into their faces. Did not name their betrayal. I simply spoke. My words were not a weapon. They were a mirror. And in that mirror, each one of them saw themselves more clearly than they wished. I told no stories designed to impress. I did not decorate my past with grandeur. I let the truth stand as it was, simple, raw, undeniable. The years I had given, the sacrifices I had carried, the promises I had kept when it cost me sleep, comfort, and even pride. I spoke of the nights no one remembered, of the work no one saw, of the people whose lives had quietly turned because I chose to bear the burden others set aside. Justice is often mistaken for thunder, for fire, for the sharp cut of vengeance. But as I spoke, I understood. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives in the stillness, in the quiet unraveling of arrogance when confronted by truth that asks for nothing, demands nothing, but refuses to bend. My voice did not accuse, but it accused nonetheless. My words did not condemn, yet they left no space for denial. Those who had laughed earlier now sat rigid in their chairs, their smiles erased. They did not interrupt. They did not dare. My silence, once mocked, had transformed into command. My voice, once dismissed, now carried more weight than all their noise combined. Even the loudest among them, the ones who had shouted over me, now stared downward, tracing the rims of their glasses, afraid to look up. My son listened too. His eyes wavered between pride and shame, trapped in the realization that he had been wrong, desperately wrong. He had believed my silence meant ignorance. Now he heard the truth of years he had never witnessed, truths carved into me long before he was old enough to understand sacrifice. Every sentence struck him differently, not as a scolding, not as an attack, but as a revelation. He could not argue. He could not laugh. He could only listen. The senator sat motionless, his face unreadable, but his presence pressed upon the others like a seal. They listened because he had commanded it, but they stayed silent because my words gave them no escape. The laughter that had once humiliated me now seemed small, ridiculous, pathetic against the weight of truth filling the room. I did not gloat. I did not savor their silence. I let my words flow calmly, steadily, like water filling cracks in stone, seeping deeper with every moment. By the time I fell quiet again, I knew I had not merely spoken, I had testified. Not to them, not even to the senator, but to something larger, to the dignity they had tried to erase, to the truth that no one could bury. And in that testimony lay justice. I had not shouted, I had not fought, but justice had come all the same. Because truth does not require volume, nor vengeance. It requires only patience. And once it arrives, it speaks for itself, louder than any voice raised in arrogance. When my words fell into silence, I did not rush to fill the space again. I let them linger where they belonged, settled heavy in the room, pressing against every chest, impossible to escape. For a moment, no one moved. It was as though the air itself held its breath, waiting for something to happen. My hands rested still on the table, my eyes lowered slightly, not in shame, but in calm resolve. I had said what needed to be said, and I no longer carried the burden of proving myself. The truth had spoken, and the truth was enough. Then the senator rose, slowly, deliberately, as though he wanted the moment to etch itself into every mind present. His eyes met mine, and he nodded, not a shallow gesture of politeness, but a firm recognition, a statement without words. I see you, I heard you. What you carry is undeniable. His palms came together, steady and strong, the first sound of applause echoing in the silence that had followed my testimony. That single act shattered the stillness. Chairs shifted, breaths caught, eyes widened. The applause spread like fire, hesitant at first, then unstoppable. People who had mocked me earlier now rose to their feet, clapping, some with heads bowed in shame, others with eyes darting nervously around as if hoping the senator's gesture might hide their earlier cruelty. They clapped not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The weight of truth had cornered them, and the senator's example had given them no way out. I looked across the sea of faces, and the irony stung sharper than their laughter ever had. These were the same mouths that had jeered, the same hands that had gestured with ridicule. Now they applauded, but they could not meet my gaze. Their eyes slid away, fixed on the senator, on their own hands, on the floor beneath them. Respect returned, but it came stained with shame. My son rose too. His movements were stiff, uncertain, as though each clap tore at his pride. His jaw clenched, his eyes fixed anywhere but on me. For him, the applause was not celebration, it was confession. Every beat of his hand seemed to whisper an apology he could not bring himself to speak. He had mocked me with silence, but now silence was no longer his weapon. It was his punishment. I did not smile. Triumph, when it is real, does not need to announce itself. I simply sat there, letting the sound of their hands wash over me, not as victory, but as vindication. I had not demanded their recognition, had not fought them for it. It had come on its own, inevitable as the turning of the tide. They had tried to bury me in laughter, but truth had risen, and in its rising, it had forced them to stand. The senator remained standing, his applause steady, unwavering, until the others faltered in exhaustion. He looked at me one last time, a quiet acknowledgement, before sitting again. His gesture had changed the room forever, not because it had given me dignity, but because it had revealed that I had never lost it. They had only failed to see. And so I sat, calm and steady, while the echoes of their applause faded into silence once more. But this silence was not like the one that had once humiliated me. This silence was full, heavy with respect, trembling with the weight of what they could not erase. It was a triumph, but not the kind won with noise or vengeance. It was the quiet triumph of a man who had endured, who had waited, who had let the truth speak for him. And now that it had, no laughter could ever bury it again. When the last echoes of applause faded, I remained still, my hands folded on the table, my eyes lowered just enough to hide the storm within me. But the storm was no longer humiliation or anger. It was something deeper, steadier, heavier than either of those things. It was the recognition that after all the laughter, after all the betrayal, after all the years of silence forced upon me, the truth had risen and stood taller than anything they had built with arrogance. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what it meant. My voice had never truly been lost. It had only been waiting. Betrayal can wound. It can strip a man of dignity in the eyes of others, cast him out of the very room he helped build, reduce him to a shadow, seated at the edges while others claim the light. Betrayal can mock, can laugh, can humiliate. It can make a man question his worth, doubt his purpose, bury his memories beneath the rubble of indifference. But betrayal cannot kill truth. It cannot erase the years of sacrifice, cannot undo the nights of labor, cannot blot out the promises kept at great cost. Betrayal may silence a man for a moment, but it cannot silence the legacy of his voice. That night, as I sat among them, I realized that respect is not a gift given freely by the crowd. It is something earned, piece by piece, through sweat, through sacrifice, through the steady endurance of years. And once it is earned, even if forgotten for a time, it always finds its way back. Respect returns, not always with applause, not always with cheers, but with the undeniable weight of truth that refuses to be erased. My son sat across from me, his head bowed, his hands resting still. He could not lift his eyes to mine. His shame was heavy, but in it there was something else, an awakening. For the first time he had seen me not as the shadow he dismissed, not as the man he believed irrelevant, but as the one whose story could silence a hall and command even a senator's respect. His silence was not the silence of contempt anymore. It was the silence of recognition. Perhaps even the silence of regret. The others fidgeted, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier bravado gone. Their laughter felt childish now, a foolish act exposed in the light of truth. They could not erase what had been spoken. They could not dismiss what had been revealed. My words, once drowned in their jeers, had become testimony. And testimony, once heard, cannot be unheard. It lodges in memory, it presses on conscience, it lingers long after noise fades. I thought then of all the years behind me, the people whose faces I carried in my memory, whose hands I had once held, whose burdens I had shouldered quietly when no one was watching. They were not in this room, but they were part of it nonetheless. Every sacrifice, every act of service, every promise fulfilled lived in me, and tonight it had spoken. Not with grandeur, not with anger, not with self-praise, but with truth. And truth, once given a voice, is louder than any mockery. When I finally lifted my eyes, I did not look at them with vengeance. I did not seek their shame. I looked at them with calm, steady certainty. Because I understood now. They could laugh again tomorrow. They could turn away. They could try to bury me once more in silence, but it would not matter. My story had already spoken louder than their laughter. My voice had already broken through the weight of betrayal. And once a voice rooted in truth rises, it cannot be buried again. Respect had returned to me, not because they offered it, but because it had never left. It lived in the sacrifices I carried, in the dignity I had protected even when the world mocked me, in the truth that had waited patiently in my silence until the right moment arrived. They had only been reminded of it. As I sat there, the senator's gaze still resting on me, I realized the legacy of a voice is not measured by how often it is heard, but by how deeply it is remembered when it finally speaks. Laughter fades, betrayal fades, even applause fades, but truth endures. And my story, once silenced, once ridiculed, now lived louder than all their mockery combined. That was my triumph. Not the applause, not the senator's nod, not the shame of those who betrayed me. My triumph was this. My voice had spoken. and it could never be silenced again. It had become part of the air they breathed, part of the weight they carried, part of the memory that would follow them long after this night was over. And in that truth, I found peace, because betrayal can take away a man's seat at the table. It can bury him in laughter, surround him with silence, strip him of recognition. But betrayal can never erase the legacy of a voice born of honor, carved in sacrifice, carried in truth. That voice will always return, and when it does, it will echo louder than all the laughter in the world.